Publishing Conference. I'm Pooja Talkacherla, Adjunct Faculty, GW, and thrilled to welcome our first presentation, Moving Towards More Equitable Publishing Practices. Very pleased to introduce my friends and colleagues here, Andrea Powell with Research for Life, and Shelby Brewster with the Public Philosophy Journal. Shelby, why don't you get us started?
Thank you so much, Pooja. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Oops, that's not it. One more time. Okay. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here and part of these conversations. So as Pooja mentioned, my name is Shelby Brewster. I'm a postdoc with the Public Philosophy Journal, which is housed in the College of Arts and Letters at Michigan State University. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about our peer review practices and how those can move us toward a more equitable publishing ecosystem. So first, I'm going to give an overview of the journal, including its mission, the kinds of work that we're interested in, and the kinds of changes we're hoping to foster in scholarly publishing. I'll introduce the journal's formative peer review process, including its philosophical foundations and how it differs from traditional practices of peer review, what the process looks like in practice as it's been used at the PPJ, and the values that it cultivates. And finally, I'm going to introduce the Collaborative Community Review Tool, which is a project that we've been working on with a number of other partners inside and outside the university that we hope will help facilitate a values-based peer review in the academy more broadly. So PPJ started in 2013 with a group of scholars, including Christopher Long, who's now at MSU, and Mark D. Fisher, who's a philosopher from Penn State, who are committed to creating a healthier peer review process and fostering connections between the academy and broader public. So they started really considering what the philosophy and practice of traditional scholarly publishing is and has been, especially in the humanities. And they really thought hard about how it is a process done in isolation, which reflects the myth of the solitary genius alone in their study creating knowledge, which, as we know, is not actually realistic or depicts how knowledge is actually created. So in traditional publishing, once something is submitted, the process of blind peer review happens completely disassociated from the author. And then after something is published, there's limited access, limited copies, and limited readership. And of course, a lot in this area has changed since the journal's creation, given all of the exciting things happening in open access. But there is still a lot of progress to be made in terms of access. And then after publication, if there is response or commentary from other members of the scholarly community, it often occurs at a remove from the scholarship itself, both in terms of time and space. So it takes more time to come out because it also goes through the process of blind peer review, and it often occurs in another publication. So this process doesn't always adhere to the values that many of us in the humanities profess, including equity, access, and collaboration. So the Public Philosophy Journal set out to explore how publishing as both a practice and a philosophy might be different, and how to bring the positive aspects of paper or traditional scholarship, like care, the amount of time invested, and an element of permanence, to a digital publishing practice that also fosters a more equitable and ethical process of peer review. So the journal's mission is to share work that engages with and addresses public concerns, content that serves as relevant and accessible scholarship shaped by public and academic scholars alike. And key to this mission is working with the public as a partnership, scholarship with the public, not for the public or on or about the public. This is especially important in our peer review process, which I'm going to detail in a moment. So we think about 4 style criteria for the material we publish, many of which align with the important values of traditional scholarly publishing. So first, relevance, scholarship that is timely and particularly important to a specific community or communities. Accessibility. So this applies in two ways. First, in terms of access, as I've already mentioned, but also accessibility in terms of the style of the content itself, unpacking technical terms, linking to related materials, providing transcripts for audio and video, and alt text for images. Intellectual coherence, so scholarship with compelling arguments that is well structured according to its particular genre. And finally, scholarly dialogue, so scholarship that cites and considers related dialogues within and beyond the academy in a variety of mediums that are not limited to peer review literature. So in order to support these values, PPJ needed an alternative model to traditional peer review, especially as those practices can enable toxic behavior, stifle diversity, and emphasize competition rather than collaboration. So at PPJ, this is called formative peer review. So I'm going to offer a general outline of this process, which can look different depending on many factors, including if we're working on a special issue that has additional editors or different types of publications, such as a forum or a discussion rather than an essay, and potentially different media, such as video or photographs. So the process begins, of course, when an author submits a piece of scholarship to the journal. So this could occur by invitation or by PPJ or by a special issue editor or by unsolicited submission. Authors also can recommend reviewers when they submit. So the piece does go through initial editorial review by the PPJ team, as some pieces are, of course, not a right fit for our journal or outside its scope. But any rejection at this stage is made with detailed recommendations for revision should the author decide to resubmit their piece to the PPJ. The piece is assigned a review coordinator. This is a member of the editorial team who supports the review process. This includes, of course, managing the nuts and bolts, communication, etc. But the review coordinator also actively collaborates in the development process, supporting both the reviewers and the author. So the review coordinator invites academic and community reviewers to participate in the review process. So each PPJ piece is reviewed by at least one academic and one community reviewer. Again, this varies by piece according to the topic, the community's focus, and the author's goals. So for example, we have an upcoming special issue about philosophy and the band Fish. So each essay has a reviewer who is a philosopher, a reviewer who is outside of academia and is a Fish fan, and a philosopher who is also a Fish fan. So reviewers evaluate the submission according to the author's feedback and PPJ's style criteria, again, supported by the review coordinator. The review coordinator helps communicate the feedback to the author. They review and work on a revision plan. This process is open. The identity of all parties are known to everyone else. The reviewers consider the revised submission, and are invited to compose a public holistic response to accompany the piece's publication. I'll talk more about that in a minute. This process can take multiple cycles depending on the author's goals, the review suggestions, but it is iterative and cyclical, so it can keep going as long as necessary. And then, of course, after copy editing and typesetting, the piece is published online alongside any accompanying responses. So here's an example of a PPJ article, Ending Life by Nancy McHugh, with an accompanying public holistic response. So these are published alongside each other. We also use Manifold, as was mentioned in the introduction. And this close proximity facilitates active engagement in a scholarly conversation and recognizes that peer review is a dialogue. Additionally, the public response makes visible the care, effort, and labor of peer review. So given that, it is an integral part of scholarship, and more of that labor is falling to marginalized folks in the academy, including non-tenured and contingent faculty. Making this work visible and concrete is an important part of PPJ's vision for ethical and equitable publishing practice. So this process is based in 4 values, which really ground all of PPJ's publishing practice. So first, thick collegiality. For PPJ, this goes beyond just being collegial in your communication with your coworkers. It is founded in mutual respect and emphasizes sharing things that are difficult in ways that can mutually deepen and advance the impact of the scholarship under consideration. And because FPR is an open peer review, participants' identities are always part of their participation. So this not only promotes accountability, but recognizes that we always bring our identities to our work. In short, peer review doesn't happen in a vacuum. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. So as I'm sure many of us are aware, there's ample research demonstrating how traditional peer review practices can perpetuate the exclusion of marginalized voices and perspectives in the academy. So a recent example of this is how the number of submissions by female authors has drastically fallen during the pandemic, while those by men have remained at the same level or even increased. So PPJ actively seeks scholarship about DEI in all its dimensions while working to expand the definitions of research and scholarship by recognizing expertise held by activists, other community members, and those in publicly engaged institutions or positions. Ethical imagination, which is founded in attentive listening, empathy, and constructive critique. Ethical imagination enables us to envision possibilities for a more just future, both inside and outside the academy. So PPJ also asks contributors for an ethics statement, which asks them to consider their own citational practice and how they are deeply engaging with scholarly conversations. And finally, trust and transparency. So as I've mentioned, FPR is completely open, designed to build trust among all parties and maintain accountability for each participant. As we know, our identities are never divorced from our work. So FPR recognizes this and sees it as a strength, not a weakness. So a project that we've just embarked on and is really exciting is the Collaborative Community Review Tool, or CCR. So supported by a grant from the Mellon Foundation, PPJ is working with the MESH team at MSU, which is made of developers, scholars, librarians, and professional publishing professionals to develop a tool that can facilitate values-based peer review like FPR. So it will support PPJ in our workflows, but we also hope that other scholarly communities will be able to use the tool to foster more open and equitable processes of peer review. The tool will have multiple options for export to publication. So hopefully folks will be able to integrate it into their existing workflows. It's being developed as an open source project to help make it available to publications of any size. So here are a couple of resources for more on the PPJ's philosophy and formative peer review. So I'll just close with a quote from one of PPJ's founders, Mark D. Fisher. In explaining the newly formed journal in 2013, Fisher remarked that community is hard. Building scholarship according to these values, which foster community, is hard. It is an iterative and flexible process that responds to the shifting needs of the participants and communities in question. Despite these difficulties, peer review processes like FPR can encourage deep thinking about the practice of publishing, why we do things the way we do, and refigure those practices to align more strongly with the values which we profess, including and especially equity. Thank you so much. I look forward to hearing your questions.
Shelby, thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. We're going to keep the question box open, so those of you listening in or watching, please do share your questions. We'll move into the next presentation with Andrea, and then we'll do some questions at the very end.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so I'm hoping you can all see my slides now. My name is Andrea Powell, and I'm the publisher coordinator for the Research for Life program. And I'm going to talk to you today about some practical steps that we're trying to take to achieve an equitable transition to open access. So quite a focused presentation looking specifically at the challenge of open access and global equity. But first of all, what is Research for Life? Some of you may not be familiar with this program. Well, Research for Life is an initiative that aims to reduce the knowledge gap between the industrialized countries of the global north and the emerging economies of the global south by providing affordable access, or ideally free access, to academic and professional resources. We were launched in 2001. So we've recently celebrated our 20th anniversary. And as you can see from this slide, we now offer a huge collection of content, something over 30,000 research journals, 111,000 plus ebooks, and a wide range of other resources like databases and reference resources. The programme is supported by 5 UN agencies, over 160 different publishers, and a number of other partners, including Yale University and Cornell University. And it's important to comment that it is a voluntary effort. So Research for Life is not a legal enterprise. It is a volunteer sort of coalition of the willing, if you like, that aims to achieve this objective. And the fact that we've kept going for 20 years really is quite a testament to the value that we provide and the commitment that the partners show. Research for Life covers all research disciplines, including these shown on the screen here, and we're expanding the range of content included all the time, particularly into the areas of social science, which has been underrepresented in the past. But we feel strongly that all research is important to achieve global equity, and so we welcome content from all aspects of scientific research and professional research. Who can use the programme? Well, Research for Life is open to not-for-profit institutions. It's not on offer to individuals, but anybody who belongs to an institution that is registered can access it. We have about 125 user countries. They are determined, their eligibility criteria is determined by or their eligibility is determined by a set of criteria that look to GDP, gross national income per capita, and other World Bank indicators. You can see here from this chart that we have a very large collection of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, all with free access to the wide range of content on offer, and many other countries where a very modest annual subscription fee of $1,500 is payable. Now, Research for Life was set up to address a very specific need, which was that researchers in the Global South were not receiving equitable access to the research that was being published, primarily by publishers and research in the North. And as the research community was moving its content and its publishing activities online, providing access to that content became achievable. So we've been delivering and solving this access problem, or trying to solve the access problem, for a long time. But what we've seen most recently is that those users' needs are changing. So having access to the information that's made available through the publishing system is really only one part of participating in the research communication ecosystem. And in many ways, you could criticize a focus purely on access to knowledge as almost a neo-colonial approach, which says, well, as long as you can have access to my research, that's fine. But what about the research that's being generated in the user countries? And indeed, we're seeing both through the literature, but also from calls to our help desk, that the users of the research information that's available through Research for Life are also likely to be producers of research content. And they need also to publish, to share their knowledge, and also to become part of the global scholarly community. And they have particular support requirements. They may not be as experienced as their peers in the global north, and so they look to us for help in getting their work published. An external influencing factor is very much the Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals were launched in 2015 and are designed to take us through to 2030, and they set a number of really very major global challenges that are designed to eradicate poverty and improve global equity in a very wide range of areas. and it's very interesting that the SDGs make it's implicit within the SDGs that access to knowledge is not an outcome of development. That's not something we should strive for. What they say is that access to knowledge is a catalyst for development, and so access to knowledge is just a prerequisite of being able to develop and to be able to improve outcomes for users and communities around the world. And because of the focus on these sustainable development goals, particularly from those who fund research, what we're seeing is an explosion, a growth in the research that's being carried out in the countries that we serve, and an increase in the number of researchers as well who are being educated to postgraduate level and who are wanting to contribute their research. The type of research they're doing is also changing in line with the SDGs. So this is a very strong stimulus and an indication that we in our network should be supporting the outputs of our users. But there's a major concern that as on the one hand, we're seeing an explosion of research and an increase in the output from the global south. At the same time, we're seeing a transition in the publishing sector to an open access business model, which is in many ways has huge advantages for the advancement of development, but could unwittingly end up creating a less equitable system than the old one, because the barrier is shifting. So no longer are we seeing a barrier to the access to content, it's the barrier is potentially moving to one's ability to publish your research if you don't have the funds to pay open access fees, or you don't have the understanding of how open access works. So anecdotally, we were seeing this. So we decided that this was something that we really needed to take a closer look at and just determine what response Research for Life should have. And we know that open access is growing in the countries where we work. We can see that actually in many ways, open access is growing more rapidly in the countries served by Research for Life than it is in other parts of the world. According to data here from extracted from Dimensions earlier this year, we're seeing that in our Research for Life countries, gold open access research articles increased by 155% over the past 5 years versus 110% against the global average. So there is a growth from a low base, of course, but there's definite demand for open access. So we don't want to stunt that growth by discovering that there are obstacles placed in the way of publication. So in order to really investigate this challenge in more depth, the Executive Council of Research for Life, which is the most senior sort of governing entity of our programme, decided to set up an open access task force. And I'm one of the chairs, the co-chair of that open access task force. And we brought in members from different partners, from the publishing side, but also from our UN agencies and our library representatives. We also tapped into the knowledge of our user advisory group. And we wanted to explore the specific challenges presented by open access and identify some very practical steps that we could take as a partnership to help achieve this equitable transition. So recognizing that open access publishing has created some barriers, what we wanted to identify what we could do to make a difference. And particularly what Research for Life could do, because with our if you like, our value proposition being all about access to knowledge, would we need to change that approach? Would we need to pivot or expand our scope and our range of services in order to support researchers as publishers or researchers as authors, as well as researchers as users? So the first issue that we identified that was really causing a problem were the whole issue around article processing charges or article publishing charges, APCs. Now, we were seeing evidence that many authors in our user countries were sometimes completely unaware that publishers have waiver policies, so that if they wanted to publish their research in a gold open access journal, they actually wouldn't have to pay the APC because they could gain a waiver. We were discovering that many researchers were actually paying those waivers even when they were eligible, paying the APCs even when they were eligible for a waiver. So it was clear that there was a lot of confusion around waiver policies across the industry. What we were discovering was that Publishers were taking different approaches. They were applying different policies. They were communicating their waiver policies in different ways. They were using different criteria to determine who would be eligible for a waiver. They were making information about the waiver policies available at a different stage within the publication process. So in some ways, sometimes authors were reluctant to even submit their research for consideration because it wasn't clear whether an APC waiver was going to be available. So this lack of consistency was just creating an extra barrier to be overcome within this particular user community. So we put our heads together and we came up with a set of best practice guidelines on how to communicate APC waiver policies. And these are guidelines for publishers. It isn't telling them what their policies should be. What it's saying is, if you have an APC waiver policy, here are some guidelines to follow to make sure that your target user audience actually understands what your policy is and knows how to access that waiver. So the sorts of things we've been recommending is that publishers should provide dedicated sections in their on their websites specifying their policy, and it should be linked to from all of their journals. They shouldn't assume that an author that a policy is consistent across their whole list, particularly some of the larger publishers. So it needs to be very, very clear what policy applies to which journal. They need to be simply written. They need to be clearly written, especially if the target audience does not have English as their first language. And crucially, that information needs to be made available to the authors as early as possible in the process, so that they can have maximum choice. They can maintain their choice of where they want to publish their article. So supporting researchers and their institutions, the waiver policies support the researchers and their institutions to understand what support is available for them to make the choice to publish open access. And I'm pleased that many of our participating publishers have now adopted these guidelines and have adapted the way that they communicate their policies. So the second challenge we took on was providing support to librarians and the users in our institutions for how they should navigate this list of publisher APC waiver policies and where to find this information. So the second output from our task force has been an index on our Research for Life website, and we're encouraging all our partner publishers to send us a link to their website where their policy is available. And I have a screenshot here that just shows it's a very simple page where the librarian at our registered institution, who is typically providing support to their user community, where they can go to easily check what the waiver policy is for the particular journal that their author wants to publish in. So our first two outputs then were very much built around what publishers can do, how they can make it easier to encourage authors to submit their articles to their open access journals and to increase the diversity in their publications. But we also wanted to hear from our users and make sure that what we were doing, the assumptions that we were making as a task force, were really were borne out by feedback from our users. So earlier this year, we carried out a major online survey of our the institutions that use Research for Life most heavily, because those are the institutions that tend to be generating research as well. And we wanted, through this survey, to understand the role that Research for Life member libraries play in helping researchers to publish via the open access business model. We know that the librarians that we work with provide a lot of support to their users, and we wanted to really understand more about how we could help them in their role. We received 370 responses from 56 countries, and the sorts of questions we were asking was whether their institution sorry, I have a sick dog. He's whining at me. We were asking if our institutions, if their institutions encourage their researchers to publish open access, and if so, what kind of support was provided to them in helping them to do that. We were asking them what sort of challenges particularly they faced. We had made some assumptions about the challenges being faced, but we wanted to hear from the users themselves and from our library contacts. We asked them what resources or support they would find useful from Research for Life. So the headline findings of our survey: 88% of our respondents said that their institution does make it a priority for authors to publish their research, with open access growing increasingly in focus. So our assumption that open access is becoming more and more popular in the countries, the lower and middle income countries of the Global South, was absolutely borne out by our survey. And interestingly, only 6% said that the preference was to publish in local journals. So here we have evidence that there's a large cohort of researchers who are desperately keen and encouraged by their institutions, and often incentivized by their institutions, to publish in international journals. And yet, but it was often there where they were finding some obstacles in terms of access to, in order to access to funds to pay APCs or other obstacles. They told us that in their institutions, they support their community, their author community, with their publishing endeavours, and only 12% said that they provided no support at all. So we're seeing that the librarians in our Research for Life institutions are really a critical support infrastructure for users. And that may sound obvious, but I think that in many maybe better funded institutions or more established institutions in the developed parts of the world, the librarians aren't necessarily playing this role. It's the support may be coming through a faculty or through a central university office, whereas in our institutions, in our countries, we are finding that the libraries are still very much seen as the first port of call for authors seeking help in their publishing activities. But they are experiencing many challenges. Lack of funds is clearly the #1 challenge. Not all publishers offer a waiver. There are other types of charges. Of those predatory publishers are targeting particularly
maybe having a few technical difficulties in the moment. So while we're giving Andrea a chance to rejoin the session and continue the conversation, I did want to remind all of our participants that you're welcome to pose questions. And we have a couple questions here that I wanted to pitch over to Dr. Brewster. So Shelby, if you can address these two questions from Patricia Mabrouk. She says, Dr. Brewster, does your process provide feedback from the authors to the reviewers? I see this as equally important in the ethical review process. Can you address whether that feedback from the authors to the reviewers is reciprocal?
Yes, absolutely. And I just want to make sure. Oh, it looks like Andrea has made it back.
Oh, sorry. I wasn't aware I dropped out then.
We lost you on the feed for a moment, so I wanted to just kind of fling a question at Shelby and just give you a chance to return. Do you mind if we just respond to this question real quick?
Please go ahead, but could you just tell me where you lost me so I know where to go back to?
I will send you a note in the chat. Go ahead and respond, Shelby.
Okay, great. Yes, thank you. This is a really good question. And the short answer is yes. The process should be a conversation, right? Ideally happening as live as it can when we're doing everything digitally. But not only can authors provide feedback to reviewers directly, but they can also provide feedback to the review coordinator in terms of working with this reviewer again for the journal. So yes, you're absolutely right. This is a really important part of an ethical practice of peer review and is something that we do at the journal.
Wonderful. And we have one more question for you, Shelby, from Patricia as well. She said, why the push for open access journal publications? I'm assuming this is for you. I'm just reading it directly. Sorry, never mind. This is actually for Andrea. Give me one
answer. I have thoughts on this, but I do think it's for Andrea.
Let's talk about open access, because it's such an essential and thorny conversation, and it deals directly with the ethics in publishing. So yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so I think the key to open access for me is that more and more folks, both inside and outside the academy, are struggling for resources. So it's not only about our author processing fees, for example, but also about fees for libraries to subscribe to a journal, for instance. So to me, as being as open as possible is more accessible and is important. But I'm sure Andrea has more eloquent and detailed information on that.
Hi, Andrea. It looks like you're back.
I am. I'm not entirely sure where you lost me, but I can answer that question as well while we're.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and address
why
the push for open access? Yeah.
Why the push for open access? Well, I think that there is increasing evidence that removing barriers to knowledge is good for global development. It's good for society. I think we've seen, particularly over the last year to 18 months, that removing barriers to all of the research related to COVID-19 has helped accelerate progress with the development of vaccines and treatment methodologies, and the sharing of knowledge on such a global issue has been literally game-changing. And now within the publishing industry, there's a lot of discussion about, well, are there other subject areas? Let's say climate change, for example. We have the COP26 meeting starting here in the UK next week. Should we be making research that's relevant to global warming, to climate change, free, because that will accelerate progress? So removing barriers to access is certainly good for the scholarly effort and the scholarly endeavour, but it has its challenges, because clearly, it has to be sustainable. There has to be a business model that covers all the costs of getting there. So, and I think when we're looking at the users in lower and middle income countries, the fact that they now have better access to knowledge has been a massive boost in their productivity, in their ability to participate in the global scholarly endeavour. But as I'm explaining, that just because access is open, that doesn't remove the other barrier to participation and other aspects of being what it takes, to be a researcher and to be part of a community. Shall I reshare my slides?
Yes, please. And I also just have one quick question, which was really instigated by your talk about the survey. Right, thank you. Was how do you handle kind of compliance? And so what I love about the presentation from both you and Shelby is you're talking about really usable tools to create, a more equitable scholarly through the process. But then once it's kind of in place, how do you ensure that everything's being done at the user, at the researcher, at the institutional level? Is the survey one of your ways of reaching back out to your partners to ensure that they're complying with these open access policies in place?
So from our point of view, what we have done so far is issue best practice guidelines. As a sort of collaborative effort involving 160 different publishers, we can't dictate how those publishers run their business. Well, we can offer advice and best practice. And what we're finding is that they're welcoming that advice and are making changes to the way that they communicate their information, because often they just hadn't thought how to communicate to this particular audience that may not be an audience that they have had huge amount of interaction with in the past. So, we can't say you should always offer a waiver, a 100% waiver to everybody that's a Research for Life author user. We'd love to, but we can't, because that's clearly not our business. And what we can do is saying, if you offer a 100% waiver to, let's say, a Group A country, that's the free access country, make sure you make it clear. Make sure that you do this so that authors are able to take advantage of that policy. There's no point having a policy unless it's properly communicated.
Absolutely. And I've got one more question here, and this is specific for you, Andrea, but of course, Shelby, if you have thoughts, do share them. This is a question from Nicole Poser. She says, Andrea mentions that only 6% of authors in Research for Life countries prefer to publish in local journals? The question from Nicole, she says, I'm curious how this varies across regions, or is there no significant variance between Latin America and Asia, for example?
To be fair, that sort of granular analysis, we're only just starting to do that at the moment. And the question was, the way it was presented gave this, remember, this is a survey of librarians rather than the authors. They were reflecting on the policies within their own institutions, and we gave them the option to say international journals, local journals, or both, and many said both. Or because they said, well, it depends on the context. But the majority of respondents said that their institution prefers their authors, where possible, to publish in international journals because of the profile that will gain them and the prestige that follows with that. But we're just now starting to do some more analysis of the data to see if there are regional variations, but we don't have that just yet.
Thank you so much. Andrea, if you want to continue where I think we lost you, or I'm not sure what happened there, but
okay.
Please do continue your presentation.
Okay, great. Well, you may have missed some of it, but it was on the screen there for a while, so you probably picked it up. This slide is simply showing some of the questions that we were asking about the problems, the challenges that are experienced within institutions when trying to publish research. And we can see here on the left that the lack of funds to pay publishing fees was cited as the most problematic area for users. So it's just reinforcing the data on the previous slide. And this is we found very interesting, because Research for Life mostly works through the librarians at our registered institutions. And so we're interested to know how we can help them to help their authors. And this question was trying to surface some of the areas where the library is helping the authors in their open access publishing activities. And we can see there that interestingly, 50% of our respondents said that they were helping their authors to select a suitable journal. So it's very important that those librarians understand the landscape of the journal options, so that they can provide that kind of support to their authors. Also helping authors to gain access to the open access fees and to understand the waiver policies that we've been talking about. So we can see the librarians playing quite a wide and significant role in helping their institutions to increase their publishing output and to help their researchers to gain more profile. So, well, what is this telling us for a start? Well, obviously, first thing is that there's a lot of data that we can continue to analyze. But one thing that was made very clear to us was that a whopping 90% of the respondents to our survey felt that Research for Life could provide more training and resources to support them in this effort. So this is providing further toolkits, webinars, training on open access publishing, mentoring and peer support. And this is an important finding for Research for Life, because this takes us back to that question of whether Research for Life should expand its offer so that it doesn't just support access to knowledge, but also access to publishing opportunity. And we're now heading into a strategic planning cycle where we can take this evidence to say, yes, we should be responding and we should be developing a broader range of support services to help authors to reach a global audience. So we're meeting, I'm hoping to be able to still make it to Amsterdam next week for a strategic review where we will consider the evidence from this survey and see how and if we can meet these needs. It's going to take funding, it's going to take additional resource and capacity, but we now have the evidence base that we need that says that if we really want to support global equity and improve the diversity of the scholarly publishing industry, we really need to take this cohort seriously and start to provide more targeted support. Just to wrap up why this matters to the publishing community is that, open should mean open for everyone, not just for the privileged few. Scholarship is increasingly global in scope, transcending geographic boundaries, and as I mentioned earlier, reaching more into parts of the world that are facing the greatest global challenges. We all understand that being more inclusive improves scholarship a diversity of voices around the table generates better outputs. And it's incumbent on all of us in the publishing industry to remove barriers to publish and to help authors have the choice that they deserve to publish in the most appropriate vehicle for their research. So as we look to the future, we firmly believe that the future is open. We want to make progress towards open access, but challenges still remain. And in order to be fully inclusive as an industry, we need to really focus on how we can leverage initiatives like Research for Life that have existed very happily and successfully for 20 years, make sure that we evolve to address the future needs of our users as well. I want to just quickly thank my colleagues on our task force that helped me to create this presentation, Jess Monaghan, Michael Donaldson and Matthias Astel from 3 of our publisher partners who produced some of the data that I've presented to you today. So thank you very much. I'll stop sharing my screen now, and I hope I haven't dropped off. Am I still here?
You're still here, Andrea. Thank you so very much for that thoughtful presentation. I'm just going to do a quick rearrangement of the screen here. So much of what you shared addresses the ethical concerns of publishing and really reflect also what Shelby shared in her presentation. And I was reminded, I think appropriately, of Christopher Long, who spoke at a somewhat recent AU Presses conference when we were able to meet in person pre-COVID. And he talked very much about the community building as being an essential component of how we kind of operate as publishers in an ethical framework. So there's a lot of points of connectivity between your presentations that I especially appreciate. We don't have any more questions coming in, but I was just curious if between your 2 presentations, you have any questions you might ask of one another, since you're both approaching ethical tools in publishing from one from an editorial production, cultivating the content, and then the second part is distribution and access to content.
Yeah, I was very keen to ask Shelby a question when I was listening to her presentation, because we often hear, and we know from other research, that researchers from the South are equally underrepresented in the peer review process. And I was wondering if your journal has reached out at all to any of those communities to engage them in your peer review system as well.
Yeah, I think this is something that we can always do better on, but you're absolutely right. We are looking to engage and sort of expand the definition of peer, right? Recognizing that expertise lies in a variety of places and from people from a variety of backgrounds. So yes, absolutely. And that's definitely something that we should work more towards in the future. And Pooja, thank you for sort of directly associating our presentations. I was thinking about the sort of scalar differences of the 2. Andrea sort of providing this macro, like big overview, and the PPJ is just one small journal right now. So just a really sort of more granular way of thinking is how I was approaching the topic. So I appreciate the sort of those 2 scales alongside each other.
And just imagine all of those journals, the 30,000 journals we have, all, I'm sure, making similar efforts to improve the diversity of their editorial boards and their peer review networks. It's a massive global effort, for sure.
And one with massive global benefit, right? It really opens up the barrier, reduces the barriers for folks even wanting to pursue scholarship as part of their lives and as part of their contributions. So it doesn't just affect people who are already in the academy, who are already publishing, but it really opens up that possibility for inquiry for others, which is massive. I think, which is kind of the heart of publishing, is people realizing that they have the opportunity to get into this community, whether scholarly or trade or otherwise, and be able to share their voice in a really constructive way. And both of you have provided tools showing just how powerful that can be.
One thing that was quite interesting, even within the members of our task force, we had representatives from very large publishers, an Elsevier person, a Springer person, and they kind of went back to their own companies and realized that there were many different approaches that they were taking, and not every journal had its own policy, but they did have some differences, and realized that what they thought were kind of, differentiating factors actually caused confusion. and the lack of consistency and cohesion actually created an obstacle that they hadn't really taken into account until then. So I think often it is just about reminding people what they should be looking out for when trying to improve diversity. Just, some things seem to be quite simple actually, but people say, oh yeah, I hadn't actually thought about that.
Yes, it's practicing self-awareness on a grand institutional scale, I think, which is something I'm so glad you both touched on so beautifully. So thank you again for being part of this discussion and being part of our larger conversation at GW. And I really hope that we can meet in person one day and we can connect again over these topics and topics as they emerge.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And apologies again for technical. And I hope my dog's whining wasn't just too distracting.
No, it's fine. We're all a community here. Andrea, thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Brewster.
Thank you.
We'll see you guys in the next session starting in about 10 minutes.